tonight is as we mentioned, is the Rebbetzins Yortzeit. It's the 22nd day on the month of Shvat. And the beautiful part of the month of Shvat is that it's filled with Yud Shvat, the 10th day of Shvat, the day the Rebbe became Rebbe. And it also has the 22nd of Shvat, which is the day that the Rebbetzin passed away. And I recall in 1988, my father, blessed memory, taking me into the funeral. I was by the funeral of the Rebbetzin, and it's really connected to this week's Parsha. We know this week's Parsha speaks about Jethro, and he was blessed to be Moses' father-in-law. And we're taught that the greatest lesson we learn of everything in life is from the Torah. And therefore, tonight, as we speak about the tale of two Rebbetzins, we're going to be discussing the uniqueness of our Rebbetzin, the Rebbe's wife, who, as we mentioned, her name was Chaya Mushka. And although when I was in 770, I was blessed to be able to go ahead and see the Rebbe almost every day in the last years during prayer service, we were able to come in. And of course, every Shabbos in the Rebbe had a Fabrengen, I would be there by the Rebbe's Fabrengen. However, the Rebbetzin, I was only able to see once in my life. And it wasn't really seeing her. She was going in from her car to the from the library into her vehicle, and I got a short glimpse of the Rebbetzin. So the uniqueness of the Rebbetzin is one which is really connected to this week's Parsha. And, you know, the Yortzeit is really a tribute, time to pay tribute to this great Rebbetzin, and they address a certain quantity, of the amount of people in this world who are so humble yet so great. So as I think about the life of the Rebbetzin, my imagination takes me back to another woman, the first Rebbetzin in Jewish history, and she is mentioned by name only 3 times in the Torah. And now, though her husband is mentioned hundreds of times, and his name is the most frequently mentioned in all of the Pentateuch, just as his achievements are considered the greatest in all history. Now, in her case, too, her husband was on public display, while his wife remained discreet and hidden from everyone. I'm referring to the wife of Moses, Tzipporah. Guess how many times her husband's name is mentioned in the Pentateuch? 3 times. Tzipporah. And Moses' name is mentioned. Are you ready? Here's the exact number, 770. No, this is not a Chabad invention. And however, his wife was mentioned 3 times. But who was this Tzipporah? Who was our nation's first Rebbetzin? Who merited to be the wife of the greatest teacher and prophet? The Torah says nothing about her persona. Now, the Torah does give us some information about Eve, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, our matriarchs. For all of them, we have brief descriptions describing their traits, their behaviors, or at least their looks. Tzipporah, the wife of Moses, has no mention of that. No person saturates the Torah. No person saturates the Bible more than he. Yet not a word is said to describe her outside of her name. The only story that tells us about her is in the book of Exodus, where while they were staying over in a hotel, and she sees an angel who wants to kill her husband, she quickly circumcises her son and saves Moses' life. Moses owns his life to Tzipporah. But who was she? So there's a fascinating medrash that sheds light on her. It says she didn't behave in a superior and snobbish fashion, says the medrash, but behaved simply and with humility. It was for this reason that Moses married her. Now, it's interesting. Nowhere in the entire Torah do we ever find an explicit reason why a certain man married a particular woman. The only exception is Moses and Tzipporah, where the Medrash quotes a tradition explaining what drew Moses to Tzipporah, her simplicity. Now, we know one more thing about her. She was not present in Egypt during the Exodus. She remained with her father in Midian and arrived in the desert only afterwards. The Torah states so clearly in the opening of this week's Parsha, of this week's Torah portion. It says, Vayishma Yisrei, and the Torah tells us that Moses' father-in-law Jethro took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after she had been sent away, and her 2 sons. Now, Moses' father-in-law Jethro and his sons and his wife came to Moses to the desert where he was encamped to the mountain of God. Why not? Why don't we know any more about him? So this is all we know. Now let us use our imagination and the assistance of the commentators to complete the puzzle. Moses, we know, was the humblest man on earth. In fact, where does the Torah state this face? When it discusses his marriage in Numbers, it speaks about Moses that way. Now we understand why it belongs there. You see, Zipporah was his perfect match. They were both the most unassuming people. They were 2 individuals content to live an anonymous, humble life with no fanfare or publicity. Now, it's not that they were weak or frail. They were 2 courageous people, but they were content to live internally rather than externally. They were all too happy to use their courage on themselves, to challenge themselves to no end. And yet the irony is, fact is always more ironic than fiction, that the most humble and unassuming figure became the most public figure of all his time. And not only his time, of all times. A discreet man, content on shepherding sheep in a desert, was plunged into the chaos of leadership. A man who was happy to commune with God Almighty and help his fellow man was now forced to confront the greatest tyrant of yore. And then for 40 years, deal with millions of Jews. Some of them were world-class nudniks, rabble-rousers, obnoxious, chronic complainers who would not stop blaming him for every problem they had. This was the tragedy of Moses. It's not that he had to put up with nudniks. It's that he never needed or wanted the position. His soul's chords were made up of a heavenly violin, which took comfort in the vastness of infinity of the universe and its creator. Suddenly, this man of such awesome highest was being attacked over the fact that the cholent at the Kiddush was too cold, or that it didn't have kishka. Now, how did he do it? So I'll tell you the secret. It was Zipporah. You know the saying, behind every great man stands a great woman and a surprise mother-in-law. You know, I heard from that when Senator Joseph Lieberman, when Al Gore chose him to be his running mate in 2000, his late mother, Marcia, a woman hitting 90 at the time, saw Mr. Gore, and as a typical Jewish mother, she approaches him and says, Al, you chose well. So as you know, Gore and Lieberman lost the elections. George Bush and his Vice President Dick Cheney were the victors. And it was a tight race. So the unconfirmed story goes that Joe Lieberman naturally came home that day deeply dejected. And the vice president would be Dick Cheney, not Joe Lieberman. So when his wife Hadassah saw him, she explained, Joe, do not worry. Don't despair. In this home, you'll always be vice president. So the Torah says nothing about Zipporah. And by saying nothing about her, it tells us everything about her. In Torah, we learn as much from what is not said as we learn from what is said. You see, Zipporah's unique power and grace lay in her parent absence. She did not need or crave the limelight in order to feel wanted, needed, significant, and loved. Virtue for her meant the silent, dignified, unwavering, and eternal commitment to goodness, to God, and most importantly, to his creatures. She was so at peace with herself. She lived in herself and with herself. As such, she created a safe and silent haven for her husband, away from the bustling life he endured outdoors. And her sacrifice was not small. Zipporah, who thought she was marrying a silent, humble shepherd, was forced to sacrifice much of her personal relationship with her husband so that he can serve the people. Now this, according to the Barbanel, is why she did not follow her husband back to Egypt, as she knew this will force him to spend time with her. While he was in a campaign to stage a revolution, she gave her husband the freedom to change the course of history. You know, I know some husbands think of themselves the same way. I'm changing the world. I don't have time to come home to my wife and my kids. Now, here's the deal. If you can manage to bring 10 plagues on Hamas, and in some places of the present Middle East, I will convince your wife too to let you off the hook. So the ultimate sacrifice this woman eventually made was accepting a separation from her saintly husband. Why? So that he might attain a higher and unprecedented level of prophecy, one referred to in the Torah as a level of face-to-face prophecy. Now, she could have insisted Moses to be home for dinner every night at 5. Or conversely, she could have enjoyed some of the honor of the grace of the Rebbetzin. Yet she chose to serve as this most incredible catalyst for all of Moses' achievements, but never to be seen. Without her sacrifices, where would we be today? We might have still been in Egypt. So Zipporah embodied true Jewish heroism, the one made up of silent, discreet acts of nobility, goodness, and dignity. Now, we're accustomed to a certain narrow definition of heroism. The Oxford Universal Dictionary defines a hero as a man who is admired for his brave or noble deeds. So heroism is a function of the admiration of others. If nobody will ever know about the deed, it ceases to be heroic. Now, this outlook is reflective of the view of the ancient Greeks. You see, the term hero comes from the Greek heroes, which means a demigod. The demigod, originally a Greek, figure who was, one parent was a god and his other parent was human. So demigods are human god hybrids. So these things must, of course, display might and power to public. The Torah, however, has a different view of a hero. The greatest deeds are those which no one but God knows about. So as an example, let us employ what is considered the most sacred and heroic deed of all times, Akedas Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, where Abraham was ready to offer his very son to God. The monumental act reflective of his complete submission to God. It happened in total privacy. Nobody but Abraham and Isaac were present. If Abraham would have gone through with the act and actually sacrificed Isaac, there would not be a single witness to this grand sacrifice and display of dedication to the Almighty. If Abraham would have attempted to share the story, not a single person would believe him. They would assume that this was his way of covering up the fact that his son abandoned him. Yet the Torah tells us that our grandfather, Azeda Avram Avinu, our grandfather Abraham, did not hesitate, nor did he call a press conference to observe his sacrifice, because he understood that a relationship with God is not about PR. It's about truth. Now, I want to contrast the story of the Kedah with Lahavdil, the most famous Greek tragedy. It's a play which revolves around the leader of the Greek coalition before and during the Trojan War, who decided to sacrifice his daughter. Why? To appease his goddess. And Artemis and Allo, his troops, set sail to preserve the honor of the battle against Troy. So in both stories, a father is ready to sacrifice a child. Well, Abraham was ready to sacrifice his son Isaac to God, for God, and before God alone. This leader sacrificed his daughter for Greece and then in the presence of Greece. So the essence of the Greek heroic act lay in its public appeal and the public nature. There was no glorification of inner heroism, but only of public display and public approval. So far from the shores of Greece was the Jewish hero. To the Jew, moral victory for both men and women is what one does for God and before God, the source of all truth and value. Jewish tradition frowns upon public display. For the moment a human acts in public, his motivation can be tainted by unworthy considerations. You know, many years ago, Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov told his disciples, in the holy city of Safed, there lived a simple but God-fearing Jew. Though not blessed with a great mind or with any exceptional talents, he served God with a whole heart and a humble spirit. Now, late one night, there was a knock on the door, and on his threshold stood an old man with a long white beard and a countenance as radiant as the heavens. And he tells him, I am Eliyahu Hanavi. I am Elijah the prophet. Eliyahu Hanavi, as we know, he's the one that comes to every Passover Seder. And he tells the visitor that, welcome to my home. Why are you here? And Elijah says, I've come to open your mind and heart and teach you the deepest secrets of creation. On the day of your bar mitzvah, continued Elijah, you did a great and wondrous deed, a deed which reverberated through all the universes. The angels and souls that dwell in high all wonder, what has this man done that has flooded the heavens with his magnificent light, such as not been seen for many generations? But your deed was too radiant for us to behold. So Elijah looks at the simple guy. He says, tell me, what is it that you did? And I will reveal to you things that only the greatest souls are privy to. So the fellow from Safed, from Tzfas, said, what I did for God alone. It's not for the knowledge of any creature, man or angel. Now Elijah pleaded, promising even greater spiritual gifts. But the man was steadfast in his refusal. And the prophet, angel, departed empty-handed. So the Baal Shem Tov says, in my previous life, I was that man. So let me ask you, dear friends, what is the Hebrew word for hero? You can always unmute yourself and answer. Can you guess? So the term employed in modern Hebrew, which is gibor, actually means strong or mighty. So what is the Hebrew word for hero? There isn't one. Why not? Because the hero concept belongs to a culture that the Torah considers false. By definition, the term does not exist in Lashon HaKodesh, in the holy Hebrew language, where every word is truth. In the value system of Torah, if something is right, good, noble, and moral, then you should do it in the privacy of your bedroom as much as you do it in public. Therefore, the word hero does not exist in the language of absolute reality. So we live in a society where greatness is measured by the appreciation and acknowledgement of others, where fame is both glamorous and desirable, and where deeds have to be reported by newspapers and websites to be noble. But for the Jewish people, if God knows, it's good enough. Now, sure, do not abstain from acting positively, even if you're doing it for good publicity, but that is never the purpose and end goal. You know, the prophet Micah put it best. He says, Higid l'cha odom atev, umo Hashem deidish mimcho, and I'll translate. Will the Lord be pleased with the thousands of rams, with a myriad of streams of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O man, says Micah, what is good and what the Lord demands of you? Only to do justice, to love loving kindness, and to walk discreetly with your God. So somewhere in the middle of the night, a baby cries. And the mother pulls out her weary body out of her bed and goes into the child's room and consoles her child. She sings an old song that her mother used to sing when she was a little girl. The baby relaxes and falls back asleep. This is not the story that will make it to CNN or Fox News. But for Jews, it's the stuff of life. It's the objective of existence. One of the gems in Yiddish literature is a story told by the secular Yiddishist writer. He was known as Yehuda Leib Y.L. Peretz. And he was born a year before our synagogue in Litchfield was built. Our shul in Litchfield was built in 1853, and he was born a year earlier in 1852. Now, it's a classic and priceless piece of Yiddish literature, and it tells a tale about the time of the year before Rosh Hashanah. And he says, early every Friday morning, in the time of the Slichos prayer, in the days before Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe of Nemirov would vanish. There's Lakeridge, Nemirov. And he was nowhere to be seen, neither in the synagogue, nor in the study houses, nor at a minyan. And he was certainly not at home. His door stood open. Whoever wished could go in and out. No one would steal from the Rebbe. But not a living creature was within. Where could the Rebbe be? Where should he be? In heaven, no doubt. That's what all the Chassidim believed. A Rebbe has plenty of business to take care of just before the days of all. Jews, God bless them, need livelihood, need peace, health, good matches for the daughters. They want to be pious and good, but our sins are so great. And the Satan of the 1,000 eyes watches the whole earth from one end to the other. So what he sees, he reports, he denounces, and he informs. Who can help us if not the Rebbe? That's what the people thought. But once a Litvak, a Jew from Lithuania where they weren't yet Chassidim, he came and he laughed. The Litvaks, they think little of the holy mystical books, but stuff themselves with Talmud and law. So the Litvak points to a passage in the Talmud, and it sticks in your eyes, where it's written that even Moses, our teacher, did not ascend to heaven during his lifetime, but remained suspended 2.5 feet below. So where could the Rebbe be? That's not my business, said Litvak. But he said, let me find out. So that same night, right after the evening prayers, the Litvak sneaks into the Rebbe's room. He slides under the Rebbe's bed and waits. He watches all night and discovers where the Rebbe vanishes and what he does during the prayers. Now, someone else might have gotten drowsy and fallen asleep, but this Litvak is never at loss. And he recites the whole tract of the Talmud by heart. At dawn, he hears the call to prayers. The Rebbe had been awake already for a long time. The Litvak has heard him groaning for a whole hour. Whoever has heard of the Rebbe Nimrod groan knows how much sorrow for all Israel, how much suffering lies in each groan. A man's heart might break hearing it. But this Litvak was made of iron, and he listens and remains where he is. The Rebbe, long life to him, lies in his bed. And who's under his bed? The Litvak. Then the Litvak hears the beds in the house begin to creak. He hears people jumping out of the beds, mumbling a few Jewish words, pouring water on their fingernails, negelwasser, banging doors. Everyone has left. It's again quiet and dark. A bit of light from the moon shines through the shutters. Finally, the Rebbe arises. First, he does what befits a Jew. Then he goes to the clothes closet and takes out a bundle of peasant clothes, linen trousers, high boots, a coat, a big felt hat, and a long white leather belt studded with brass nails. And the Rebbe gets dressed, and from his coat pocket dangles the end of a heavy peasant robe. The Rebbe goes out, and this Litvak follows him. On the way, the Rebbe stops in the kitchen, bends down, takes an axe from the bed, puts it into his belt, and leaves the house. The Litvak trembles but continues to follow. So a hushed dread of the days of awe hung over the dark streets. And every once in a while, a cry rises from some minion reciting the Slichos prayer, or from a sickbed. And the Rebbe hugs the sides of the streets, keeping to the shade of the houses. He glides from house to house. And who's behind him? The Litvak. The Litvak hears the sound of his heartbeats mingling with the sound of the Rebbe's heavy steps. But he keeps on going and follows the Rebbe to the outskirts of the town. Now a small wood stands just outside the town. The Rebbe enters the wood. He takes 30 or 40 steps and stops by a small tree. Now the Litvak, is overcome with amazement, watches the Rebbe take the axe out of his belt, and he strikes the tree. He hears the tree crack and fall. The Rebbe chops the tree into logs and the logs into sticks. Then he makes a bundle of the wood and ties it with a rope in his pocket. And he puts the wood on his back. He shoves the axe back into his belt and returns to the town. He stops at a back street beside a small, broken-down shack and knocks on the window. "Who's there?" asks a frightened voice. Now the Litvak recognize it as the voice of a sick Jewish woman. "I," answers the Rebbe in the accent of a peasant. "Who is I?" asks the woman. Again, the Rebbe answers in Russian, "Vasil." So the woman cries and says, "Who is Vasil and what do you want?" So the Rebbe says, "I have wood to sell very cheap." And not waiting for the woman's reply, he goes into the house. The Litvak steals in after him, and the gray light of early morning, he sees a poor room with broken, miserable furnishing, a sick woman wrapped in rags who's lying in the bed. And she complains bitterly, "Buy? How can I buy? Where will a poor widow get money?" "I'll lend you," answers the supposed Vasil. "It's only 6 cents. So the woman cries and says, "And how will I ever pay you back?" "Foolish one," says the Rebbe. "See, you're a poor sick Jew, and I'm ready to trust you with a little wood. I'm sure you'll pay, while you have such a great and mighty God, and you don't trust him for 6 cents. So the woman says, "And who will kindle fire? Have I the strength to get up? My son's at work." So the Rebbe says, "I'll kindle the fire." So as the Rebbe puts the wood into the oven, he recited in a groan the first portion of the Slichas prayer. As he kindled the fire and the wood burned brightly, he recited a bit more joyously the second portion of the Slichas prayer. When the fire was set, he recited the third portion and then shut the stove. The Litvak who saw all this became the disciple of the Rebbe. And ever after, when another Hasidic disciple tells how the Rebbe of Nemirov ascends to heaven at the time of the Slichas prayer, the Litvak does not laugh. He only adds quietly, in Yiddish, "Oib nish noch hecher," if not even higher. You know, did you ever wonder, if you look at the Hanukkah menorah, why the shamash always stands taller and higher than all the other candles in the menorah? I'll share an answer given by our dear Rebbe. You know, it's the first night of Hanukkah, and a single flame is glowing at the right side of the menorah. One flame. Aren't there two? Two? Oh, you mean the shamash? He doesn't count. Second night. How many candles do we light tonight, your child asks you? 2, you say. 2 flames. Aren't there 3 candles set up? So you reply 3. Oh, you mean the shamash? He doesn't count. So night after night, the shamash goes about his task of kindling lights. Each evening, he welcomes the newcomer and settles them into the place of the menorah. 2 flames, 3 flames, 4 flames. The shamash brings to life and then stands watch over them. Still, the shamash doesn't count. He gives all the light to the candles, but he never attains the status of a Hanukkah light in his own right. He never thinks about himself. His entire job in life is to bring light to others. And this is why the shamash towers above all the other lights in the menorah. You see, to forgo one's own needs in order to awaken the flame in others, there's no greater virtue. So the shamash is indeed higher than all. So the Greeks called their hero, a demigod. We call our version of heroes a shamash, which means a servant. You see, from a Torah perspective, the greatest form of virtue is when you transcend the need for public recognition, and I'm more happy to do something good for the sake of goodness, for the sake of truth, for the sake of God. In the immortal words of Maimonides, you do truth for the sake of truth. You know, in downtown Los Angeles, in Little Tokyo, one block from the Japanese American National Museum, stands a man, a statue of a man, who most people have never heard of and wouldn't even recognize. His name was Sugihara, and he did an extraordinary thing 7 decades ago. You see, Sugihara was a diplomat working at the Japanese consulate in Lithuania during the first years of World War II. So as the Nazi forces threatened to overrun the small nation, thousands of Jewish refugees who already had fled the horrors of Poland crammed around the compound, desperate for safe passages out of the country. Now, Sugihara didn't hesitate. Disobeying direct orders and thus risking his own career and indeed freedom, he issued visa after visa, scribbling them out as quickly as he could possibly do, and even enlisting his wife to help him over the course of nearly a month. He was often staying up all night to process ever more. Survivors recall that Sugihara, who was forced to vacate the compound, even thrust completed stamped visas out of his train window as it pulled away from the platform. So in all those who would otherwise be destined for the gas chambers were spared by Sugihara. They fled to Japan and often onto other nations from there. For years, the survivors and the families tried to locate Sugihara, if only to thank him for what he did. He paid a heavy price for his actions, and after spending 18 months in a Soviet prison camp and finally returning to Japan, he was asked to resign his post, likely as a direct result of this incredible story. Sugihara lived out the remainder of his days quietly, discreetly, until happily, in 1985, just a year before his death, he was honored with a Righteous Among the Nations award, an honor bestowed on non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews. And he shares the titles with the likes of Oscar Schindler. Now, heroes come in all forms, and there are times each of us may be called upon to be heroic. Sugihara heard that call, and he answered it resoundingly. And one of those that he gave visas to and saved his life was my dear grandfather. And if not for Sugihara, I wouldn't be schmoozing tonight. So in my mind, this captures one aspect of the life of Rebbetzin Chaim Mushka, whose yahrzeit we mark tonight. You know, the Rebbe by nature was extremely private. He was unassuming and discreet. His wife was woven of the same fabric. But there was a guy, his name was Julius Lassner, and he was deeply impressed by the Rebbetzins' warmth. He had met her, and he liked her hospitality and the genuine interest she took in others. And one Sunday morning, as the Rebbe was giving out dollars, she passed by, and he passed by the Rebbe, and he summoned up the courage, and he told the Rebbe, after meeting your wife, I understand the expression behind every great man is a great woman. And the Rebbe smiled from ear to ear. So when the Rebbe's father-in-law asked him once to send him letters frequently describing his emotions and experiences, the Rebbe declined, saying that some people are social and some people just live completely within themselves. He says, I do not know what is better, but I am from the latter category. Now his father-in-law pleaded with him to become chief rabbi of Paris, a position that was offered him in 1938, but he refused. He was extremely kind and giving, and he was a very strong personality, but all very discreetly and privately. He once shared with a Parisian rabbi that whenever he needed to speak in public, it was a fight against his own nature. And he said this in 1969 to Rabbi Hillel Pesner, 19 years after he served as a Rebbe and spoke for hundreds of hours. But fate had it otherwise. In 1950, the Rebbe realized that history had other plans for him. God wanted him to redefine his life. A most private figure was charged with the mission of not only leading a movement, but rebuilding Jewish life in the whole world after the Holocaust, including Northwest Connecticut, from Oxford to Litchfield, from Lake Ridge to Salisbury. Now he accepted the decree, and once he did, he never looked back. Suddenly, a man who loved curling over books for 21 hours a day was meeting hundreds of people each week and guiding them about toothaches, stomach aches, dealings with mother-in-laws, raising children, finding a job. Now he was confronted with the duties of serving as a Rebbe and a leader to thousands of Jews and hundreds of communities, and withholding his pulse on the beat of every vibration among the people of Israel. A man whose soul resided in infinity, evident from his talks and writings. He was forced to spend his life dealing with the burdens of many a nudnik and many a problem. How do you do it? So the Rebbe had his tzipora, his wife, unassuming like he, continued to live a most discreet life. People rarely saw her or knew her. She lived in almost complete secrecy, yet with complete selflessness and kindness. She created a safe, private, nurturing haven for her husband, allowing him to go out and deal with an entire world. Now, for several decades, the Rebbe, in addition to all of his other exhausting duties, he received people for private audiences a few nights a week. Sometimes he would come home on President Street at 3 a.m., sometimes 5 in the morning, and on occasion he returned when he was already light outside. The Rebbetzin always waited up for the Rebbe, that her husband should come home to a dark house and a cold supper to be eaten alone was simply not an option. The Rebbetzin went to extraordinary measures to ensure that her husband would come home to a haven of peace, tranquility, and support. During the Shiva for the passing of the Rebbetzin, a black cleaning lady by the name of Shirley entered the home. And she began weeping, crying bitterly. And Rabbi Leibel Groner and Rabbi Benjamin Klein were the Rebbe's secretaries after she was crying over the passing of Mrs. Schneerson. She responded that she was crying primarily not for the Rebbetzin, but for the person she left behind. Her husband, the Rebbe. You see, the back woman explained, every day when the Rebbe came home, he sat for 15 minutes drinking tea with his wife. And if you saw him during those 15 minutes, he appeared completely relaxed, without a worry in the world, without any tension, without a trace of anguish. Now that she passed on, I'm worried not about the tea, but I'm crying for this man. Who will provide him with those daily 15 minutes of absolute serenity? So I want to end with a story. It was a winter morning in 1966. It was 3:30 in the morning. The Rebbe had already left his office for his home. A somewhat early night, and just then a woman frantically phoned the Rebbe's secretary, saying that a little baby had just fallen and he was badly hurt. He was in critical condition. And the doctors were arguing over which procedures to perform. And she desperately needed the Rebbe's blessing and advice. So the Rebbe's secretary apologetically explained that it would have to wait until the morning, and they would consult with the Rebbe first thing after he arrived. So this mother starts crying and says, it's a matter of life and death. I need an answer now. So the secretary decided to dial the Rebbe's house, and if someone would answer, he would apologize for calling so late. He dialed uneasily, and the Rebbetzin answered. In Yiddish, he said, Veret, who is talking? So the secretary gave his name and immediately said, I'm sorry for calling so late. And he proceeded to apologize profusely. It's a chutzpah, he says, to call it such a loud, but there's a lady here in desperate need. She says it's a matter of life and death. So the Rebbetzin exclaimed, why are you asking forgiveness? On the contrary, My husband and I were sent to this world to serve people in need for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. By you calling us, you're helping us fulfill the mission. So, though the Rebbetzin was brought up in a home similar to the one she later had, one where a man of the house, her father, who was the Rebbe, was totally devoted to the well-being of the Jewish nation. Still, while growing up in Europe, she had been blessed with a large family network and support group. Not so in America, where she didn't have much family at all, nor any children to be occupied with. So it was a great personal cost that she gave up her husband so that the lives of others would be improved and so the entire world, including our corner of Connecticut, could be better. And I heard from Rabbi Leibel Grona that the Rebbetzin told him you could call 24 hours a day. So this was Rebbetzin Chaim Mushka. She lived by herself, in herself, but not for herself. In her absence, she taught us one of the most valuable lessons in life, the life of virtue, heroism, nobility, and goodness. That all begins and sometimes ends within the intimate space of you and God. You know, the Talmud relates the story of Rabbi Akiva, who was a simple shepherd, whose wife, seeing his enormous potential to revitalize Judaism after the Roman destruction, she sent him away to study in a rabbinical school, not for a year, not for 2 years, but for 24 years. When he returned home as the greatest sage of the generation, he told his 24,000 of his students these words: what is mine and what is yours all belongs to her. So this we can see of Rebbetzin Chaim Mushka Schneerson. May her memory inspire us until the coming of Mashiach now. And may we merit to have the ultimate time, the coming of Mashiach. If you have any questions, you could unmute yourself. Speaking about Mashiach, I just wanted to share that we're going to be doing a grand trip to Israel. April 1st, Israel needs us now more than ever, an itinerary which is one of a kind that was ever had by all our trips forever. And I think that the greatest blessing that we have is that while we're in Golus, while we're in exile, is to take a bit of the inspiration of the Rebbetzin and the Rebbe of every single day thinking and acting of how we can make the world a better place, not only for ourselves, but for the entire world around us. And many of us taking our precious time to come out and learn Torah. May God bless everyone with the best of health and only good news until the coming of Mashiach now. Good Shabbos.